On this day, the 11th of February, 1812, the term gerrymandering first came into circulation. This referred to the governor, Governor Gerry, or more accurately, Gerry, is how his name is pronounced apparently. Mr. Gerry was opposed, actually, to these redistricting in the ways that it was done. However, his name has become linked to this practice forevermore. Let's have a look at how gerrymandering began. Elbridge Gerry. That is the man that gerrymandering is named after. This man was an American founding father, quite a radical in the days where he was active. He opposed British colonial policy in the 1760s, where they're trying to get the American colonialists to pay for the war that protected them. And he refused to sign the Declaration of Independence because it didn't have a Bill of Rights attached to it at the time. So, in many ways, this man was a man of principle, but he was a bit, how would you say it, all over the place. He had money problems throughout his time, and that's one of the reasons why he became Madison's vice president. Because he needed a bit of extra money because he didn't have any himself. However, he was, when he became famous, or not when he became famous, when he became famous to history, it was during his time as the Governor of Massachusetts. And this was a position that he had tried to get a number of times and had failed. And he finally became the governor. And at first, he was opposed in the state legislature by the opposition. And so he had to be quite moderate, quote-unquote. And so he was seen as someone who could play both sides. When his side, I think they were called the Republicans at the time, it's very difficult because there's so many different parties in the United States with the same names. Democratic Republicans, then later on another Republican Party, and Whigs, and all this sort of thing. But his party gained control of the state legislature. And so he started pushing a policy where he was getting rid of judges he didn't like, stacking the state Supreme Court, and he signed into law a bill that created new districts, constituencies we'd call them. And one of the constituencies was mocked, you could say, by the press because it looked a bit like a salamander. And they nicknamed it the Gerrymander, although it would have been Gerrymander at the time. But everyone read it and they saw Gerry, and that's how we usually pronounce Gerry, and it became the Gerrymander. And so he put his name to something that is now seen as quite awful. When I first learned about the term gerrymander, it was a good while ago when I was in school, and at the time I had assumed that this was something that just happened in history, that it was some far-off thing that had since been fixed. Kind of like how you learn about the Great Reform Acts and how only a certain number of men could vote, and that eventually more men could vote. It was 1832, the Great Reform Act. 1867, the next Great Reform Act. 1886, the next Great Reform Act, and each time more and more people could vote. They got rid of the rotten boroughs, they got rid of corruption in politics, they started limiting how much money you could spend on campaigns, they brought in the secret ballot, they got rid of discrimination against Catholics, that sort of thing. And then finally we get up to 1918 and we have the Fourth Great Reform Act, Representation of the People Act, where all men, pretty much, over the age of 21 and all women over the age of 30 could vote, and then 10 years later that was brought down for women to the same age as men, and so everyone could vote then. And then in 1968 they brought it down to 18. It just assumes that something like gerrymandering, which did happen in many places, was ancient history, something that happened 200 years ago. And then, at some point, I realized that in the United States, they still gerrymander as a matter of policy, which I found to be utterly shocking at the time, because you see some of the maps and the shapes of their, I don't know what you call them, districts or constituencies, I'm not sure. It's insane how obviously manipulated these are. I think there's only one state that I know of, Iowa, that doesn't gerrymander its districts, but everyone else does. So, look at the ones in Illinois, or Texas, or North Carolina, or pretty much anywhere, and it doesn't even matter if they're Democrat or Republican. They both seem to try to manipulate it so much to give themselves a majority. And that is very alien to me when, where I've been, we have independent electoral commissions that draw up borders, and they have certain criteria where it has to be within certain borders, similar populations, it can't have all these weird shapes to it, it should be as compact as possible, which all sounds very sensible to me. And in other systems where they have proportional representation, it's not as important because it's very difficult to gerrymander in a proportional system. And so I'd always assumed that this was just something that happened a long time ago when things weren't as good. And it's just something that happens in the United States. I'm sure it does happen in other places, but you would think somewhere as advanced and as sophisticated as the United States would have dealt with this a long time ago. They talk about all these various things, oh, it's unfair to do this or that or the other. You'd think one of the first things would be to have consistent districts, that they wouldn't be manipulating districts for party political reasons. And yet, that's exactly what happens. And so what of this Eldridge Gerry? Well, as I said before, he was quite a radical in his day, and his name has been attached to something which is unpalatable, you could say. His own son-in-law said it was not something that he would want to be attached to. The governor himself, Eldridge Gerry, didn't actually like the idea of basically gerrymandering the system, which wasn't the word at the time, but stacking the system towards one group. However, he did sign it into law. He did support it because he kind of had to, because it was on his own side that put this law through. But this thing had been going on before. It had different names with different people's first or last names stuck on to Mander to make the whole point that it was a corrupt thing to do. And yet, throughout the entire history of the United States, has never really been pushed back on. This sort of thing has been abolished and reformed in many other countries, and proportional representation has, in most countries, gotten rid of this, because it's almost impossible to fiddle a vote if you've got proportional representation. It's one of the reasons why Robert Mugabe brought in first past the post when he had total power, because he realized that with single member constituencies, first past the post, all he had to do was stuff the ballot boxes a little bit, and he could win a landslide in the parliamentary elections. And obviously he had stuffed the ballot boxes for his presidential election as well. With multi-member constituencies, with party lists, although I'm not in favour of party lists, I'd be more a STV sort of guy. But even with all the party lists and things like that, it's still very difficult to stuff a ballot box, because you can't just vote once. You've got to vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And even if you're trying to stuff it, it's very difficult to guess how it's going to go. It might even backfire against you if you try to stuff a ballot box in a proportional system. Another reason it's difficult is because you have multi-member constituencies, and so you might get 2 of the seats, even 3 of the seats. You can't get all 4 or 5 of them unless you're really taking the mick and you're going overboard. It's a little bit too obvious at that point. So most countries with proportional representation, it's very difficult or impossible to swing elections the way you want them to. And even in the countries with first past the post, Canada, United Kingdom, I'm not sure about India, I'm not going to say anything about that. But in most of these countries, and in France, obviously, they've done it so they got rid of the whole gerrymandering thing, where it's almost impossible to do it. Now, not every border in a constituency is perfect, but you can make it level. You can make it sensible. You can make it geographically consistent, which is not what happens in many parts of the United States. And I'm amazed that this isn't a bigger issue. It's not something that people protest. It's not something that people have been putting on ballots, having referenda on. And until then, until the United States has sorted out its electoral system, I don't think I want to hear them complaining. So, that is video on Eldridge Gerry and his gerrymandering. If you like these videos, come back tomorrow for more. Like, subscribe, and comment, please.